Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds by nerds. I'm Nerdcast Dave, and today I'm joined by Stephen Dewey of 10 Candles. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing fantastic. How are you doing today?
Good. So 10 Candles, is that your first RPG that you've designed?
10 Candles is my first publicly available RPG that I've published and put out there. It's sort of the start of that sort of realm of existence for me as a game designer.
Had, so that's your first time thing ever. Like you didn't do any other design work or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some very light contributing design work to a very small number of products. If you look me up on RPG Geek, you can find some really not very well known titles that I've technically contributed to. But 10 Candles is really my first one.
Well, I mean, that's awesome and impressive because you kind of like nailed it out of the park, with the first one. It's very popular indie game, and I hear it brought up and mentioned, quite often. Even on these chats, it's people have mentioned it quite a few times.
Yeah, it has been very surprising and exciting with the amount of notice that 10 Candles has gotten and the amount of support that the community has given it. I don't really know what I anticipated going in, but that was
Yeah.
definitely not it. I didn't know what people would think. I had sort of a very humble and reasonable Kickstarter to kick things off, but it has continued to sort of grow, and the community supporting it has grown as well. So it's been very exciting.
So you had mentioned you're working on another game now.
I am, yeah. So I'm in the process. So I had a Kickstarter a year or two ago for a game called Gather: Children of the Evertree, which is a vast departure from 10 Candles as a card-based game, tabletop game slash live action game that centers around immersive world building over the course of a conversation that you have with the other players. Um, it's not out yet. With the state of the world, many things have been delayed, but I am very excited for it to be released either sometime, hopefully in 2021 is when I'm hoping for it to come out. But it's a very different game, but also very exciting.
So you feeling the pressure, after being so successful with the first one, to follow up?
I think so. There is there's a lot of expectation, I think, for the sorts of games that I make. Just having put out a single game,
Yeah.
there is a lot of assumptions I find that some people tend to make about, well, oh, this is a new horror game designer, for example, just because my first game happened to be a horror game. And all the designs I have in the works right now really aren't that, and are exploring a lot of other different genres and a lot of other different ideas. I think that it will be exciting to throw another couple bigger games out there. I've had some small ones going out, but I think that will lend itself to some interesting discussion, especially because all of my game designs tend to be a little weird.
Yeah.
Everyone that's successful sort of gives me permission to be a little bit more weird on the next one.
I really appreciate that because we've even been asked like, are you ever going to create your own game? I'm like, there's so many great games out there. I don't know what my voice would add or what I have to say about it. And then, in the same breath, when someone's like pitching me a new game and I'm like, well, why are you using this mechanic? And they're like, just to be different. I'm like, well, that's lame. I hate to do something just to do it or just to be different. It's just like serve a purpose. Um,
Yeah.
and it seems like, and that's where you're finding the niche and you're finding these purposes. Like you're like, RPG games are great and all, but how about some fire? Like, how did that
Yeah.
come about?
It really I am a very every aspect of my game design. I'm very I don't want to use the word obsessed, but that's probably the most accurate. Um, with really wanting there to be a strong reflection between the rules and the between the rules of the game and the setting of the game. That's been something I really like to reflect in my rule systems. Anytime you build a rule, even if it's really strange, there should be a very distinct reason for it to be there, whether it's a reflection of what's happening in the game or it serves some necessary emotional component of the game. So when 10 Candles was coming together, the whole idea of the rules reflecting the state and the story that the characters are going through, the rules supporting the arcs of emotion and of storytelling that the session is going to want to pursue. And everything there being kind of a reflection of itself, it lends to, in order for to tell a story about characters slowly being destroyed and eventually very much being lost, there's a certain amount of destruction, I feel like, that's almost necessary in the rules, which lends itself to setting things on fire, watching candles go out. Candles are very fragile, much like the lives of the characters. You watch the components of those characters literally turn to ashes as you play the game. It's all meant to be very self-referential and to help support and immerse you in kind of what the whole idea of the game is from the start.
So, and that's a really interesting design in modern RPGs, because I feel like players are more precious with their characters than ever. And this is a game where you're like, nah, we're just going to set them on fire and burn them down. And that's how the game ends. Like, you play until the candles go out, right?
It gives you, I think, so much freedom with that idea. And a lot of the time I'll see or I'll hear questions about like, oh, should I really tell my players they're going to die? That seems like it would be a better thing to sort of have as the twist of the game or as a surprise at the end. And I have to shout from the rooftops, you have to tell them.
Yeah.
Because it really, that the whole game hinges upon having that freedom and knowledge as a player so that you can approach the game with the understanding of what's going to happen. And based on that, be able to make not just decisions as your character, but as to make storytelling decisions, because the players take a lot of the storytelling role in this game, and use that power to shape the game in ways that are going to be more interesting and more impactful.
Yeah. I mean, when, when you play a game, you're always going to be more successful as a group when you have player buy-in. And so by letting them know up front, this is the expectation, this is what's going to happen, instead of traumatizing them at some point during the game. Because they're like, I don't play these games to die and all of a sudden they're dead. That's a new thing. But like you said, if you can go into it, it, and it informs your decisions, and maybe you're a little more cautious with your character to make them last longer, or more reckless because if you're going to go out, you really want to go out.
Yeah, I find that players are generally more willing to both do things that they would never do with a normal character, take more risks, because they know they're going to die at the end anyway, and they also know they're not going to die until the end. So it can be really interesting to jump through fire in a way when it's really early in the game and you're going to be fine, but because you think it would be more interesting. And then the other aspect of that being that because players have all that narrative control, both in resolving encounters at the start of the game and also creating truths in the sort of between scene portion of the game, if they are just thinking that they're in a survival horror game or that they have an option to win in the traditional sense, they're going to use all of that power to help themselves. Whereas the game would be much better served and is often much more exciting if players use that narrative power to maybe help themselves a little bit, but also introduce more challenges that the players are going to have to deal with over the course of the game, because that's more narratively interesting.
So what's an example of a game or scenario you would run a group through?
Oh, I've run groups through so many scenarios. I mean, there's a bunch of scenarios that are just in the book, which I think are great examples. The default setting of 10 Candles, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that the world has gone dark. 10 days ago, the world went dark. The sun has gone out or is covered over. There's no stars in the sky. The world has just gone into darkness. And 5 days ago, something came out of that darkness or from within it that is hunting down humanity. And it's sort of the classic horror movie, stay in the light, there are monsters in the darkness sort of pitch. But outside of that, 10 Candles really shines when you find that despite the fact that it's really designed for these one-shot sessions, obviously, you can have immense replayability with setting up different modules where you're going to be in a different place, you're trying to do a different thing, you've got a different monster, you're playing these different characters. So I've run games, I've run sort of some of the basic games where you're survivors trying to escape a city in the middle of this darkened apocalypse. But I've also run sessions where you're a team of scientists that are trying to figure out why the sky's gone dark and try to fix it, with the potential of maybe being able to do that before the game ends. The game's always going to end the same way with your characters dying, but they might be able to make an impact on the world before they do. You can also you can kind of throw out the default setting and play around with a lot of more unique modules. So there's one in the book where it's just like a teen slasher horror flick, like you're at a cabin in the woods and it's spring break and everything is normal, but also there's a killer there or something horrible. I've run a module where you were a party of adventurers in like a classic fantasy game on your way to steal the hoard of a dragon, or a team of superheroes that are fighting against, Marvel style superheroes fighting against some incredible threat to Earth. And we know they're going off to fight their final fight, but maybe they save the world before they do, right? That's sort of always the stakes at hand. So there's so much variety in which you can sort of build a session around, with really the only restriction being that all the characters are going to die at the end of the game. That always just sort of has to happen. But beyond that, you can kind of build up the game however you'd like.
So what are the core mechanics?
So 10 Candles is mainly based around a pool of six-sided dice. At the start of the game, the players have 10 six-sided dice that form this communal pool that they use. And whenever you would want to overcome a challenge, if there's something that something that the characters are trying to do for which the outcome is uncertain, or there may be a little luck involved, or even if the GM just doesn't know what the outcome would look like maybe the players are picking the lock on a door or trying to open a drawer in a desk, and the GM hasn't decided what's inside and doesn't have an idea for that. In all of those circumstances, they can call for a conflict roll. When a conflict roll happens, the players, whatever player triggered it, would grab the big pool of dice and roll it. And if they get at least 1 6, they succeed. Any ones that they roll are removed from the pool for the remainder of the scene that the players are working through. And that's a communal pool. So that pool will get smaller increasingly for all of the players, until eventually they don't roll a 6 and the scene ends. One of the 10 tea light candles that you're playing by is darkened, and the pool resets, but now only up to 9 dice. And the GM will get the 10th remainder dice that's essentially passed over. Why the GM having dice matters is because every time the players make a roll, the GM will also roll to see if they get equal or more 6s. And if they do, then the GM actually gets narrative control over the outcome of that success. So as the game sort of flows, you're going to have at most 10 scenes. for each of these candles. In that first scene, in the first several scenes, the players have a tremendous amount of power. They're rolling a huge pool of dice. They're going to be getting sixes all the time. These are going to be longer scenes. The GM has basically no dice, and in the case of the first scene, just has none. So the players are also going to have a lot of narrative control. So every time they succeed at anything, if they're searching for supplies, the GM would say, okay, what do you find? It's totally up to the players. But as the game goes, as each scene drags on, the pool gets smaller and smaller, increasing the chance of something horrible happening and a failure. And then as each scene passes to the next, both that power that the players have to succeed at everything, and also literally their narrative control over the game, slowly slips die by die into the hands of the GM, until eventually you're at your final scene where the GM has 9 dice. They're basically narrating everything at this point. They've taken up all these threads the players have introduced and are dragging it towards the inevitable conclusion. The players have 1 die left on the final scene, and every time that a player fails their roll, rather than it just darkening the candle, their character dies. And you continue with that final scene until all of the characters have died, at which point the final candle is extinguished. So those are the basic rules. There's a lot of other little things in there. Obviously, characters have like a character sheet, which is built up of a number of index cards that you can actually burn, set on fire as the game goes to re-roll dice and to gain some benefits. There's a stage between each scene where the players can establish a number of things as being true, as well as the GM, to kind of move the action forward, like in a movie, to the next scene. We can move forward in space and time and gather things that are interesting to us, or establish things about the story that are interesting. But it's intended to be a fairly rules-light system. It's very focused on the narrative, and really all of the mechanics are there to lighten the load that the GM has to help tell a frightening story. Because even just intrinsic in the rules, you're having that loss of power and that loss of control. So that does a lot of that really nice setup for the kind of arc you would want in a horror story.
Do you have a favorite, like scenario or genre you like to run through it? I mean, it's horror, but it sounds like it's horror mashed with a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to get a little weird with my modules. I like when I'm running it, I tend towards pretty surreal horror, and really opening up the narrative control to everyone to mess with the game in really interesting ways. But at the end of the day, I don't really it's designed, the game is designed as such to be a zero prep game, and I revel in that when I'm running it, and I imagine a lot of other GMs do the same. Whereas there's really not too much that I build ahead of time. I'll write up like a paragraph or two that's sort of a module I'm pitching to the players, and I like to get sort of weird with it. I like to go outside of the standard modules. But from that point on, I really don't have much planned. So how weird it gets, how horrifying it gets, what genres it sort of is taken towards is largely up to the players and the group to negotiate while we're playing. So it can really vary depending on what players are interested in.
So the burning of index cards, does that represent a loss of power in the game?
It does. I think it metaphorically, it goes, it can go in a lot of directions, but that was sort of what it was intended as. You're literally watching your character slowly burn away as the game goes on.
Yeah.
Now, mechanically, that does grant you access to more parts of your character every time you're willing to burn part of it. So you're encouraged to do that. It gives you some amount of additional control over the narrative. And one of the things that I really enjoy is because 10 Candles is meant to play just by the light of the candles, whenever you do burn up a part of yourself, there is also this very brief flash of light around the table, which brightens up the room for a little bit, which also has a really interesting effect. It sort of is The use of your cards and traits like that really lends itself to kind of be the heartbeat of the game, and these very brief moments where the group is almost brought closer together. So it helps you highlight those parts of your character in really interesting ways.
Is there a flash paper version of index cards you could get?
I've heard some people use flash paper. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Have you had any stories come back where someone's burned down their house yet?
Thankfully, no. And there's a detailed disclaimer at the start of the rule book saying that basically you should never play this with real fire because you'll burn down your house.
Yeah, yeah.
Many reports of fire alarms going off, but never because they're playing and burning cards right beneath a fire alarm in their house. But thankfully, nothing worse than that so far.
Awesome. So you're also a professional dungeon master. And how much has your experience with designing 10 Candles and running those games, how much of that goes into your D&D games? Or, is this really just kind of like portions of how you are running your D&D games that you've expanded upon into its own system?
Well, it's tricky. I think that gets back to sort of my roots of role playing, which I've played some form of tabletop game basically for my entire life, since I could roll dice and count numbers. I also got involved pretty early in my life in live action role playing games. So elements from that sort of style of play, like a focus on immersion and on emotional play, that has sort of cemented itself in and has been brought into how I run games like Dungeons and Dragons or other games like that over the years. And then around probably like in the middle of when I was going to college was when I was sort of brought into doing more of the independent story games. And that's when I started picking up a few of the games kind of that the indie design community has put out there, and playing those and being introduced to those for the first time. So 10 Candles was sort of the combination, I think, of both my long life of experience with gaming of many kinds, my roots in immersion and emotional play that I got through live action role playing, and also being exposed to a lot of what independent games could be and how you could play around with that.
So we're discussing a little bit, and I kind of ask everyone when we come on, especially in these weird times, is during the apocalypse, are you playing more or less or the same amount of games?
I think I would say that I'm playing more currently. At least in terms of role playing games. I have as you mentioned, I am a professional sort of GM, so I'm running I'm dungeon mastering 2 professional D&D games right now. I also have my home group that I'm running for, and I'm actually playing in a game, which is still very strange for me. I'm sort of a lifelong GM, so playing in any game is very odd. But I think that despite all of the horrible things that are happening in the world right now, there is a desire that some people have to be able to hop on to an online game with some people that they're friends with and play games. So my dance card as far as games online has been filling up pretty nicely. I've also found some friends to play some digital games with occasionally. So I would say that gaming has definitely gone up. Thankfully, it's out there as there's a version of it that is out there as an option, because it's been a very important aspect of me surviving the pandemic and everything that's happening in the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like us as gamers, and streamers, we were already ready for this. We were set up for this. Like, this is all territory we've gone over before. The biggest difference is there's more people at home, so there's more people to like draw from to play with. Yeah, and it's really cool because, well, I mean, silver linings, I guess. But it's nice the fact that people who would not consider gaming online before are doing it now because it's the only way to game. So it's like broadening their horizons, but it also helps the community as a whole because there's just more people playing games and have more access. As content creators, we always hear, I can't find a group, I can't find people to game with, and now like no one can go to their local hobby store or get together with their local group, so everyone is flocking online and
Yeah.
doing really well. I mean, we've joked about like the VTTs getting together with Zoom to launch this whole diabolical plot in order to increase their profits. Maybe that could be your next 10 candles campaign.
Very possibly.
So what kind of D&D games are you running?
So right now I have a group that I'm running the newly released Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden for. I've just been kicking off with that. My two other groups that I'm running for both of them, I'm running a fully homebrewed game that I'm hoping possibly one day to publish. So I've played D&D since I was like 10.
Yeah.
It's been a big part of my life. So I've gotten very into 5th edition and have been exploring a lot of different adventures in that and writing my own stuff. So I know most of my stuff has been most of my game design has been very much within that indie sphere, but I'm hoping to involve my passion and history with D&D more and more as I have more time to work on projects. I have been posting some D&D Dungeon Master theory over on my Patreon, which has been well received. But I'm hoping to write more with D&D in the future.
Yeah, and speaking of your Patreon, that along with some other links are in the description as always, folks. So you can go follow Steven around the web for sure. So how is Rime of the Frost Maiden going for you? That's kind of horror centric. I mean, now you're kind of known for writing a horror game. So is there more pressure when you're looking through this, or are you kind of a horror snob now, or?
I have definitely been more exposed to horror in the last 5 years than probably any other time in my life. But it's been fun. It's meant to be sort of a horror styled adventure.
Yeah.
And it is, and I think it hits the mark there in some cases. I think the campaign gives you what you need to get halfway there, and then the other half of the way you need to have a good DM to pull it forward and tie a pretty horrifying bow on it. But I've been enjoying it so far, and largely because this was sort of my first official D&D module that a D&D adventure I was sort of running as it released. I've never really done that before. And I was delighted to find an incredible amount of fellow dungeon masters and creators that have sort of built up these communities on Facebook and Reddit and Discord that are just flooding them with all of their amazing ideas, which has made my job a lot easier and more exciting to do. So it has surprised me with the amount of community surrounding that module. And sort of as a result of that, I was able to put my heads together with some other dungeon masters and come up with some really exciting ideas.
Yeah,
it's a fun game.
There's always a bunch of guides on the DM's Guild as well when they drop, where people kind of add some filler or some help for the adventures where they feel like they kind of fall down a little bit. And also, so I guess this is Watts' second dip into horror with 5e. And horror is just a tough genre to begin with, and even harder in D&D. Do you have any tips for dungeon masters trying to run horror with D&D and getting the scary into it?
I think it largely, at the end of the day, I think it largely comes down to pre-negotiation with your players, and well, I guess let's start with that one. So I think that there is, with the group that I'm currently running, you know, I am a proud advocate of the session zero, where you can sort of go over expectations and plans with your players. When I had it with that group, we had sort of decided that in honor of the sort of game that we all wanted to have, we were going to be implementing some some homebrew rules and some expectations of the group for, you know, what we want to get out of the campaign. So things like, we are going to stay really focused on the campaign. We're not going to have a lot of out-of-game chatter. We're going to, show up on time and be really work towards immersion and staying in game as our characters. And also that we were all sort of collectively open to the difficulty level being ratcheted up. Like, I'm not going to pull any punches. I'm not going to save characters when they shouldn't reasonably be saved. If they screw things up, I'm not going to save them. And just having that honest discussion with your players about, are we all okay with the stakes being higher, just from like a basic, or, you know, we're going to commit, we're going to all have that buy-in. We are going to, be willing to commit to this. That is such an important part of building any kind of horror theme or feel around your table. Because in order to really have that feel, you need a certain level of immersion. So the term that the other aspect of it that I was going to mention, that I was struggling to find the word for, was with any kind of horror RPG, the golden word of what you're trying to achieve is something called bleed, emotional bleed. This was a term coined by Emily Care-Boss, who's a fantastic indie game designer. But the basic idea of it is that what bleed is it is when a character feels something, and that emotion bleeds through to you as a player, and then it is a thing that your player feels, or vice versa. Your player feels something, and then that bleeds into what your character feels. This can happen in both directions. So a common example of this in live action role-playing games is you might have like an in-game relationship with another character. Your character and this other character are involved in a romantic relationship. And then you exit the game, you're out of character, the game is done for the weekend, and you find that you have feelings for the player of that character, right? Because that emotional, sort of romantic emotion has bled out into the real world. This is something that, you know, a lot of games try to help avoid, but in horror games, it's basically required. In order for because if you're sitting at home on a computer, you know, in Roll20, or you're around a table rolling dice with friends, the stakes aren't very high. You need to, you're not going to be frightened. There's nothing there that's going to jump out at you and scare you. It's very hard to get jump scares at your game table. It can be done. I mean, I've seen some great examples of Matt Mercer doing it on Critical Role, right? If you have the right level of buy-in and engagement from your players, you can get there. But most of the time, that isn't really going to work. So what you need to do is have there be, in order for your characters, the characters within the game, to feel scared and like they're in a tense and frightening situation, your players need to have a little bit of fear. That's where things like these pre-negotiations can come in, where I'm not going to pull any punches. If your character dies, there's no resurrection. If you are, you lay out all these out-of-game, completely not related to in-game at all, but these out-of-game consequences and like levels of difficulty. And your players are going to have that in the back of their mind, which will make the characters feel like every encounter is more dangerous. They're going to be more likely to run away from an encounter than engage it, or to abandon it quickly if it looks like it's going wrong. And even though the player might be doing that for out-of-game reasons, it's going to bleed into that in-game emotion. The other flip side of that is you want to make sure it goes the other way around as well. So you want to make sure that you as a DM are really doing your best to sow terror in your game, whether it is through sort of grisly and dark, descriptions of the world around you, whether it is through this, building up these like strange monsters, building suspense, seeding dangers, paying a lot more attention to how you're describing the world, how you're describing the monsters. Like in this campaign I'm running more than any others, I'm taking so many liberties to describe the brutality of combat as it is happening. Because to make it clear like what the monsters are doing and why it's horrifying. And even though, again, that's not, the players aren't in any danger, the fact that you're describing that for the characters and you're having these characters go through these traumatic experiences, that bleeds out to the players. And that cross of sort of emotion is only made easier the more you can kind of shorten the distance between the players and their characters. So keeping them focused, keeping them immersed, playing music in the background, trying to take minimal breaks. All of these things keep players more engaged with the story, so that distance becomes shorter for that emotion to pass through more rapidly. That's one of the things that 10 Candles does by having you play it in the dark, by having there be a limited amount of time you can play it in. All of those sort of atmospheric components of the game are meant to immerse and engage the players, because if they're locked in on the story, then they are very close, metaphorically, to their characters, and that bleed of emotions is going to be much more constant and back and forth, which will help build that horror and that suspense. So it's doable. You just have to chat with your players, get that buy-in, and then make sure you're working overtime to really drive home the horror that the characters are facing. And between those 2 points of sort of engagement, you're going to get players being more spooked than they might normally be in a tabletop game.
Yeah, the feel the buy-in is so important. It's hard to scare people that don't want to be scared. So you have to go in with the right mindset. I will say one dirty trick, especially for like Rime of the Frost Maiden, would be to lower the temperature wherever you're playing a little bit. Just enough, right? Subtly, or even maybe get up while you game every once in a while and lower it again. Just to make it a little bit chilly. Just because when you can engage more senses, I feel like that also lends itself.
Yeah, I will always say, make sure that is a fantastic thing to do, assuming you like session 0 cleared it with your players first.
Yeah.
Just because you don't want obviously anyone to be put in a you never want the players are always more important than the game. So you want to make sure you have safety tools in place, especially if you're running a horror game, whether you're using the X cards, script change, whatever safety tools you want. And if you are going to be sort of putting the players through anything, whether it's turning off the lights, lighting candles, changing the temperature, if there's going to be sudden noises from like a sound generator that you're going to throw out in the middle of the campaign to try to jump scare them. Those are all like tools you could use. Just make sure you chat about it with your players first. Even if it's going to be like, you're not going to tell them every time you're going to do it, but like, hey, is everyone cool with this? And then once you sort of get the sign off on that and players know they have safety tools in place, you can go hog wild with it. And everyone can be on the same page about like having that buy-in and being really excited to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's one of those things you could easily be like, here's a list of things that may or may not happen during the session. Right. Would any of these bother you? And then you can use blinds and veils and that kind of stuff in order to, navigate and negotiate that with your players or whatever safety tools you want to use.
Exactly.
Works for your group. So, we've been chatting away and I'm looking at my chat and I'm like, it is blank. I'm like, is this thing even on? And I had to refresh the page and it is going. So I'm going to jump in there and grab some questions.
Yeah, let's get some questions. Hi,
Ribbon wants to know, time always shapes the horror and pop culture of the era. What or how would you personify the horror that has become our time? That is a weird question, just because like you have our time and then you have 2020, and they feel like just two separate things.
Yeah, I mean, time, like if you get into, and based on this question, I'm sure you're already aware of this, but for others who aren't aware, if you really get into um, the theory behind horror, and you go back and you really look into the types of horror movies or horror media that have been out at certain points over the course of history, you start to see these common themes at certain times, and you can really get into the root of like what is this, and why was this scary at the time, like why were zombies such a big thing at this time? Why were vampires such a big thing at this time? And it is almost always because of real world events that were sort of amplifying that specific type of horror. And that horror, you can really get into the theory behind it, which I am not educated enough to do, but vampires were representative of this, or the fear of this, or zombies were represented by the fear of this. And you can really get into that. I can't really speak to exactly what about right now is shaping horror media, largely because I think based on the increasing avenues by which we can gain access to media now. So, streaming services, and it's not just movies anymore, right? Now that we have streaming services and all these things, I think a lot of media that is not necessarily specifically based on culturally what kind of horror we're looking for, a lot of other types of horror media are coming out right now, because there's a more availability and ability to create now than ever before, which is really exciting. But I have seen I have seen some tremendous horror coming out over the past several years. Probably some of my favorite horror that's come out recently has largely been because basically anything Jordan Peele has touched. Go watch Get Out if you haven't yet. All of his movies have been just absolutely incredible. So I don't have a great answer for that. I'm not a horror scholar, but
Yeah.
I imagine that with COVID happening right now, with the political, I think that a lot of horror over the past couple of years has been largely influenced by the political and sort of social state of at least the United States, if not the world. And I think that a lot of horror that we're going to get over the next several years is going to continue to have its roots in that, and also in the pandemic that has been happening.
Looking at you, Purge.
Yeah, like we're going to see a lot of that out there. Things that have to do with an inability to connect with others in the way that we'd like to. It's only a matter of time before we're going to start getting a tremendous amount of pandemic horror movies as a direct result of what happened here. It may take a while for it not to be too soon, but it's definitely going to happen. Time really does shape things like that, 100%.
So BK Dan wants to know, is there a horror dragon? And you mentioned running, a 10 Candles game where your adventurer is going, to slay a dragon or get the dragon's loot.
Yeah, what is the best horror dragon? That's a great question. I think it so largely depends on what kind of story you're looking to tell. Like, so in my D&D game I'm running right now, I have some pretty horrific dragons that are coming about, one of whom is also a vampire, which is pretty miserable for the players. I think that regardless of if it's a dragon or some other monster, the most I think the largest thing you can sort of throw at players to build that horror is something that they do not expect or falls outside of their normal understanding of how a creature works. So if you want a dragon to, in your D&D campaign that is meant to really bring out that sort of horror theme for your players, none of the dragons in the monster manual are really going to cut it. You need something unique, or that approaches the party in a different way, or that they need to deal with in a different way. Because as soon as they run in and they realize this is not your run-of-the-mill dragon, that is where things get especially terrifying.
Yeah, we've kind of been inundated with dragons, so it becomes tough, right? And it's one of the reasons I don't like using dragons in D&D, right? Because I hold a certain amount of reverence for them, and I don't feel like the game does it justice, because they really just become another monster to kill at a certain point. And they should be like, they should actually have more horror elements if you think about it. Like the Dragon Awe effect, has been in the game since the beginning. And that just kind of speaks to that primal dread that humanity feels for these creatures. So much so, just being in their presence is enough to paralyze you with fear.
Yeah, I think really if you're building up a dragon that you want to be terrifying for your players, I think that the takeaway at the end of the day is that you kind of need to follow the rules laid out by some of the most terrifying monsters in horror media in general, which is to say, if it's just a random monster that you throw at your players, it's not going to be much. But if it's a monster, if it's a dragon, for example, that they've heard about for a while and they've seen at a distance, and they have witnessed the destruction it brings, even if they didn't have a chance to fight it personally, and they've seen what it can do, or possibly they even did encounter it when they were much weaker and it sent them running, like when they were nowhere near able to fight it. But just like the less it's seen, like with any monster, it's the thing you don't see, the thing you don't understand or know the strength of, that you've seen it, you found cities in its wake that are just destroyed. You know how dangerous it is from what other characters have told you, and you build it up appropriately. If you build up any threat like that, it's going to be a lot more terrifying for your players.
Like one of my favorite scenes from, whether it's the animated movie, the live action movie, or the books, is from The Hobbit, when, you first encounter Smaug, right? Mm-hmm. And he knows that his lair has been infiltrated, and, he's basically describing himself and, what it means to kind of be a dragon. And, even in like the earliest editions of D&D, like you couldn't just shoot a dragon with an arrow. They're immune to missile weapons and that weren't magic. So the dragon has evolved and changed a bit. They were a bit scarier in the earlier editions. Mm-hmm. I feel like, and the mechanics kind of supported that as well. Also, I've been meaning to ask you, what edition did you start with?
When I got into D&D, when I first got into it, it was probably my 8th grade or something like that. I got into 3rd edition. I got into 3rd edition just sort of long enough to buy 5 or 6 books just before they released 3.5.
Yeah.
So
if you could have just waited 6 months more.
Yeah, I sort of bridged that gap, I guess. And then 3.5 carried me basically through my high school days. And then when I was in college, probably around sometime when I was in college, was when they made the switch to 4th edition. So I switched to Pathfinder because I wanted to stick with 3.5, and stuck with that basically until 5th ed had been out for a little while and had been proven to be everything I wanted in a game. And that's what I've been playing since.
Nice. Actually, like circling back to the game you're working on now, what are the mechanics to that?
Oh, this is always a weird one to explain, but bear with me.
Uh,
So Gather is a world building game at its core. It's played with a deck of cards that basically carry you through the game. And what the sort of idea, what the concept behind the game is that each of the players around the table are playing as representatives of their kinship, their community, their village, whatever it might be. And these are communities and kinships that are spread out vastly across their sort of home, which is known as the Evertree, which is, if you will imagine, a massive world tree of sorts. And you are a representative for one of the communities that lives somewhere in this Evertree, whether it's on its distant branches or up in the astral crown of the tree or down near the roots that dig into the soil. Every year, all of these communities will send a speaker, in this case, your character, to the Gather, which is this annual meeting for all of these speakers to come and discuss the affairs of the Evertree over the past year. The deck of cards sort of guides you through this meeting. And the session is just that. It's the Gather. It's this meeting between these representatives. And every card you flip over, a player will draw a card. They'll read from it. It might give us a little bit of narration or kind of set the scene. It may lay out the rules of the Gather that must be followed and sort of how you can have this discussion. Because really the rules of the game come down to how this meeting is conducted, because there is a mountain of customs and requirements and very strict rules about how this meeting can be conducted, and who can speak and when can they speak and how can they speak, to share this information with each other that needs to be shared. So as you play through, you eventually will get to the cards that are sort of the bulk of the meeting, which are these question cards. And they will be prompts to have you flesh out what your kinship is. Not only what their name is, but the first like 5 questions of the game are like, what is your name? How many individuals are within your kinship? How many have been born this past year? How many have died? What do you have in abundance, or what are you lacking? What do you need? And why have you come to the Gather? Why specifically have you shown up? It's not just sort of an open discussion, which is the crux of the game. There are these rules in terms of how you can answer, when you can answer. And that effectively comes down to all of the characters clamoring to be heard and exchanging tokens around the table to give each other opportunities to speak and answer those questions a little bit more thoroughly. And as you're kind of answering these question prompts, you are fleshing out this world as you play. It's not like a map making game like some other games that are out there. All of this discussion is just happening around the table. There's no preparation. There's no character creation in this game. Your character is never even named because they're there speaking on behalf of their community. But as you go through and answer these question prompts, as you sort of improvise answers to them as part of the group, you are building out a story of this world guided by these question prompts. You're learning who these kinships are. Why are they here? What do they need? Are there conflicts between some kinships? Are there alliances to be formed? Is the Evertree in danger? All of these things are answered every single game. And then at the end of the game, you will actually create a new question based on your Gather this year and add a new card to the game with your new question to have the potential of being asked in future meetings. So it's a weird, like, kind of semi-live action because you're almost embodying a character seated around a table at this meeting. Tabletop game, you're passing around these tokens, you're managing who's talking and when, and at the end of it, you will have built this remarkably emotional and descriptive and like full-bodied understanding of these communities and how they interact with each other.
Have Have you ever used the premise of this game or the game to build a world that you were then going to play your RPG in?
I've heard some comments from people thinking that that might be a lot of fun. The the only hangup is that because the setting of Gather is so specifically this tree,
Mhm.
unless you were running a game in this tree, you would probably be out of luck. But if you wanted to, you absolutely could. And my hope is that I can potentially spin the idea of Gather into other settings in the future, which might allow for something more like that. But right now it's very standalone.
Yeah.
But it does, like any world building game, it does sort of set you up with a world that as soon as the game is over, you kind of want to play in
Yeah.
and go adventuring in to see what happens next. And it's sort of I'm really happy with the game in that form because it's very much like the meeting, thinking in like Lord of the Rings. It's very much a meeting like when they decide, okay, Frodo's going to take the ring to Mordor. It's that meeting with a
Yeah.
lot more going on in it, but it's that meeting. And then you're like, all right, let's go. And then that's the end of the game. It takes that little moment and teases it out into this 3, 4, 5 hour like intense discussion about this world, leaving you with knowledge of things that are going to come, like possibly war that's being declared or crises that need to be solved. That none of that's happening here, but we're talking about what we're going to do in the year to come, and leaving you walking away from the table being like, I wonder what happened next. But maybe you get together with those friends again and you play the next year's Gather meeting. Maybe some of the kinships are gone. Maybe some of them have returned. You can sort of build them like that, which can also be interesting.
So when you first mentioned the tree, I thought, it made me think of Norse mythology, Sidril, how, all the realms are connected by the tree. But no, you're like, no, they literally like live in the tree.
It's just a big tree. Yeah. It's a really big tree.
Uh,
100%.
or they're just really tiny people.
And yeah,
So,
these are great questions.
yeah, but I still feel like that could still be a fun campaign
Oh,
to
sure.
explore. And the idea that if you were to do that kind of with the players and they were to play their representatives, you just imagine the buy-in you would get from that group when you actually did begin running it because they built the world. Yeah, it's going to mean so much more to them.
Right. Yeah, and that might be something that I play with the design of down the road.
Yeah.
The idea of like maybe, right now the game I'm excited about is this meeting, but maybe another game I will be excited about will be the aftermath of that meeting, or maybe even something else within that world and presented as, 2 or 3 linked games together that all take place in this world. It's always so hard to predict where uh, what little aspect of a world or a story will intrigue me. And this is definitely a very unique sort of part of it, but it works so darn well. Like I'm reminded of, I feel so deeply ashamed that I don't remember the name of this, but there is a game a game in a fantastic anthology that is basically about a group of heroic fantasy adventurers having basically their last night together before they go off and they fight the big bad evil thing. And the entire game is just that last campfire that they share. And it's beautifully and brilliantly done, and it captures this one little sliver of a larger story and teases it out into this beautiful experience. I love the sort of thing that people can do with games like that, especially indie games where you don't always need a big campaign. You get these little corners of story, and they can just be really special.
So we are up on the hour mark, and I know you're sharing your lunch break with us, which I really appreciate. Final thoughts before we head on out?
Keep playing games. Don't let the world get you down. I guess I'm really appreciative that you had me on. This was a lot of fun. I always love talking about 10 Candles. As you mentioned, my links are down below, so if people want to follow me, please do so. I hope to put out all manner of very strange, weird little games in the future, and I hope you'll enjoy all of them.
Well, I'm here for it. Thanks for coming on. It's been a great chat and have a good time getting to know you. And everyone else, until next time, stay nerdy.